sun was doing its best to warm the cobblestones of St. Mary Mead that morning, but the village had a way of keeping its chill even in the brightest light. Outside the post office, Mrs. Price Ridley was already at her usual post, pretending to read her newspaper but keeping a sharp eye on every passer-by. The air smelled faintly of lavender and gossip, the two great perfumes of village life. Inside the vicarage, tea was being poured. Mrs. Bantry, brisk and rosy-cheeked from her walk, stirred 2 spoonfuls of sugar into her cup before realizing she had forgotten the milk. "I do swear, Griselda," she sighed, "if one could measure forgetfulness in ounces, I should need a bigger cup." The vicar's wife laughed lightly, but her hands trembled as she reached for the jug. Her eyes, though smiling, were fixed on the doorway where a young maid stood, pale, anxious, and holding a folded letter. "It's from the manor, ma'am," said the maid, voice low. "Mrs. Loder says it's urgent." The laughter in the room fell away as quickly as it had come. The name alone, Mrs. Loder, had the power to draw silence from even the boldest tongues in the parish. A woman of money, temper, and endless social invitations, Mrs. Loder was the sort who ruled her household like a ship captain and her friends like a small empire. Griselda opened the letter. Her eyes widened, and for a moment she simply stared. Then she whispered, "She's dead." Within the hour, word had spread faster than the post. Mrs. Loder had been found at her breakfast table, head slumped over her cup, one hand still clutching the silver teaspoon. The police were already on their way from Much Benham, but by the time they arrived, the entire village had its own version of the truth. Poison, some said. Heart failure, others insisted. Mrs. Bantry had heard from her charwoman that the milk had tasted oddly sweet. Miss Hartnell, meanwhile, swore she had seen the gardener sneaking about near the kitchen door the night before. And in her neat cottage at the end of the lane, Miss Marple sat quietly by her window, knitting a pale blue cardigan that would never quite get finished. She had heard the church bell toll once for the dead, then twice, and she knew before anyone knocked who the subject must be. She looked down at her teacup, where the milk had swirled into delicate white ribbons. "Sweet," she murmured. "Yes, sometimes far too sweet." She rose, fetched her hat, and placed it just so upon her head. Outside, the lane was already humming with speculation. Miss Marple walked into it as though into a familiar garden, careful not to step on the young shoots of truth that so often grew among weeds. By late afternoon, the lanes of St. Mary Mead were abuzz with theories dressed up as facts. The grocer's boy had sworn he'd seen Dr. Haydock's motor car speeding toward the manor before breakfast, while Mrs. Bantry had already assured the vicar that poison was the only explanation. Though, she admitted, Mrs. Loder had never looked the sort to go quietly. The police, under the care of Inspector Crale from Much Benham, had cordoned off the house, which only made the villagers more determined to imagine what might be happening inside. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had made her way there under the most natural of pretenses. She had, after all, once given Mrs. Loder advice about a wasp's nest in her pantry, and was thought of, even by the inspector, as a harmless curiosity. She was admitted to the morning room, where the heavy curtains had been drawn against the October sun. The air smelled faintly of lilies and something less pleasant beneath, the faint tang of milk gone wrong. The breakfast table had been left as it was. The silverware glimmered dully, the toast rack still half full, the butter dish smeared at one end. And there, beside a cup of tea now cold and milky white, was the smallest crack in a saucer. Not large enough to matter, not small enough to escape her notice. Miss Marple's eyes lingered. "A fine china set," she murmured softly. "But this cup? Not from the same set, I think." The constable standing nearby blinked, uncertain if she was speaking to him. "No, ma'am. One from the kitchen," they said. "The maid dropped the proper one this morning. This was fetched as a replacement." "How clever of her," Miss Marple said absently, though her mind was already turning elsewhere. Replacements, in her experience, were rarely as innocent as they appeared. She thanked the constable and moved toward the open doorway, where the inspector himself loomed. A large man with too little patience for details and too much confidence in his first impressions. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said with forced geniality. "Tragic business. We'll know soon enough what killed her, but I'd wager it's her own doing. Weak heart, nerves, all that." "Indeed," she replied, her voice calm as still water, though I was under the impression that Mrs. Loder took her health rather seriously. Morning walks, plain foods, and a most careful eye on what she drank. The inspector frowned, already losing interest. "Well, she drank the wrong thing this morning, that's certain." Outside, the sky was beginning to bruise with evening light. Miss Marple paused on the doorstep, her eyes falling upon the milkman's cart rattling away down the lane. She had noticed it earlier, standing a little too long by the back gate before the commotion began. And now, as she walked slowly home, she could not help thinking how strange it was that no one else seemed to wonder where the milk had come from, or how it had reached the manor earlier than usual. That night, she sat by her fire, knitting forgotten in her lap, and listened to the wind moving through the thatched roofs. She thought of the tea, the cup, the maid's trembling hands, and the milk's odd sweetness. In St. Mary Mead, one learned to listen to silences as much as words. And tonight, the village was holding its breath. The following morning began with a pale drizzle, the kind that settled on the hedges like dusted glass, and made the lane smell faintly of damp earth. Miss Marple rose earlier than usual. Sleep had been elusive. Her mind kept circling back to that cracked saucer and the milk that had come too soon. She put on her cardigan, not the blue one she had been knitting, but an old rose-colored one with thinning cuffs, and walked toward the village with her umbrella tucked neatly beneath her arm. At the dairy, Mr. Pottle looked surprised to see her. "Morning, Miss Marple. Bit early for your order, isn't it?" She smiled. "Oh, I thought I'd stretch my legs. I did wonder, though, if your boy made his rounds a little earlier yesterday. I passed your cart by the manor gate before 8. He scratched his chin. "That's right, ma'am. Young Alfie set off early. Mrs. Loder's cook asked for the milk special. Needed it before breakfast," she said. Miss Marple's gaze softened. Before breakfast. How conscientious of her. "Odd request, though," he added. "They usually take it with the rest about 9. As she left, she thought about the cook. Mrs. Finch had been with the Loders for 10 years and was said to have hands that could whip up a sponge cake to make a bishop weep. Loyalty, however, did not always grow as sweetly as people supposed. By mid-morning, Miss Marple was at the church hall where the Women's Institute had gathered, ostensibly to arrange flowers, but in truth to dissect the murder. Their voices rose and fell like birds in a hedge. "I heard it was cyanide," Mrs. Price Ridley declared, rather enjoying herself. "Nonsense," Miss Hartnell replied, sniffing. "It was that poor maid's doing. The trembling one, what's her name, Annie? You could see she was hiding something." Miss Marple listened, fingers resting lightly on the handle of her basket. Rumors were useful things. They told you not what had happened, but what people wished had happened. And in St. Mary Mead, wishing was half the truth. When she returned home, she found a note slipped under her door. The handwriting was hurried, the paper cheap. "Please, ma'am, don't tell them I dropped the cup." "I didn't mean to. I only did what she told me." It was unsigned, but she knew at once whose hand had written it. The maid, Annie. Miss Marple sat down by the fire, eyes narrowing slightly. Someone had given that girl an instruction she now regretted. Dropping the cup might have seemed an accident to the inspector, but accidents, Miss Marple knew, often required rehearsal. Outside, the church bell struck 12, and the drizzle turned to steady rain. In the quiet ticking of the clock, she could almost hear the shape of the truth forming. Faint, fragile, but unmistakably near. Miss Marple did not move for a long time after reading the note. The rain whispered against the window, and the fire hissed softly as if in thought. The words "I only did what she told me" looped in her mind like a thread that refused to fray. Who was she? Mrs. Finch, the cook? Or perhaps someone higher up the household ladder, someone whose instructions would be followed without question? Annie was frightened, that much was clear. Frightened people wrote in haste, but guilt had a different texture. And this, Miss Marple thought, was not guilt, but fear. By late afternoon, she had made up her mind. She walked briskly through the drizzle, her umbrella a small moving dot of grey among the hedgerows, and turned toward the manor once more. The constable at the gate, young and still slightly nervous around her, hesitated but then let her in. She found Mrs. Finch in the scullery, sleeves rolled up, scrubbing a pot that looked clean enough to eat from. Her movements were too quick, her answers too ready. "Terrible thing, miss," the cook said without prompting. "The mistress gone, the police tramping through her rooms, and the servants treated like criminals. I tell you, it's not fair." "Indeed," said Miss Marple kindly, setting down her umbrella. "And poor Annie must find it especially hard. I understand she was quite devoted to Mrs. Loder." Mrs. Finch's hands slowed. That girl has more nerves than sense. She was bound to get herself in trouble sooner or later, always listening where she shouldn't. Miss Marple tilted her head. Curiosity is an easy sin in a household full of secrets. The woman gave a sharp glance, then looked away. "If you're implying something, Miss Marple, you'd best speak plain." "Oh, I rarely imply," she said softly. "I merely notice. For instance, the milk bottle delivered early yesterday morning was unopened when the police arrived. Yet Mrs. Loder's cup was full. Someone must have poured from another source, perhaps before breakfast." The cook froze. A faint rattle came from the pot lid she'd been drying. "That's nonsense. The kitchen milk's kept separate, that's all. Annie fetched it herself." Miss Marple smiled, a small, almost invisible gesture. How thoughtful of her to fetch it without being told. Or was she told? Mrs. Finch said nothing. Outside, the rain had eased, leaving the world washed clean and pale. In that silence, Miss Marple heard the faintest shift. A change in breathing, a heartbeat too quick. Then the cook turned, busying herself again with her pots, but the tremor in her hands betrayed her. When Miss Marple left, she paused by the kitchen door. On the step lay a small glass vial, half hidden by the mud, its label peeled away by moisture. She slipped it delicately into her glove before walking home, her mind now curiously still. That evening, as the church bells marked 7, she examined it by lamplight. The faintest scent lingered. Sharp, sweet, metallic. Not cyanide. Something slower, something meant to mimic the body's surrender. She set the vial beside the folded note and leaned back, eyes half closed. In St. Mary Mead, motives were like tea bags. They only revealed their strength when steeped. Someone, she knew, had been steeping theirs for quite some time. Morning came grey and damp, the kind of English morning where every sound seems softened by mist. Miss Marple, after her quiet breakfast, slipped the small glass vial into her handbag and walked toward the village chemist. She did not hurry. She never did. Haste, she often said, was the surest way to miss what mattered. Mr. Abbott, the chemist, greeted her with a polite smile, though he raised an eyebrow when she placed the vial upon the counter. "Would you be so kind as to tell me," she asked gently, "what this once contained? I found it in the lane near the manor." He examined it, holding it up to the light. "Well now, curious thing that. Smells like chloral hydrate, if I'm not mistaken. A sedative. Not common these days, though still used by some for sleeplessness." Miss Marple's eyes met his in quiet understanding. "I imagine it would be most unpleasant if taken in quantity, especially in tea." "Good heavens, yes," he said, lowering his voice. "Fatal if the dose were strong enough. Slows the heart." She thanked him kindly and left, though her mind had already leapt several steps ahead. Mrs. Loder had not been poisoned violently. She had simply gone to sleep and not woken up. It was subtle, domestic almost, the sort of method chosen not by a stranger but by someone accustomed to her routines. Someone who poured tea every morning and knew exactly how she took it. At the post office, Mrs. Price Ridley was dispensing gossip like sweets. "They say the maid's been taken in for questioning," she announced loudly, ensuring half the room could hear. "Always the quiet ones, isn't it?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Indeed, though sometimes quiet people do what they're told, especially when they're frightened." That afternoon, she walked to the vicarage, where Dr. Haydock had come to take tea with Griselda and her husband. He greeted her warmly, though his expression clouded when she mentioned the late Mrs. Loder. "Inspector Crale's convinced it's a heart failure," he said, shaking his head. "Nothing to suggest foul play." "Except," Miss Marple murmured, "that Mrs. Loder's heart gave out within minutes of drinking her tea, and that her cook seems unusually nervous about something she claims not to understand." Dr. Haydock frowned. "Do you think the cook had a hand in it?" "Oh, no," said Miss Marple softly. "But I think she knows who did." The doctor looked at her in surprise, but she only smiled. "You see, I've lived long enough to know that guilt and grief have different voices. Mrs. Finch sounded neither, only fear. Someone has made her an accomplice without her consent." As dusk began to fall, Miss Marple returned home and drew her curtains. She took the folded note from her writing desk and read it once more. The trembling scrawl of Annie's words seemed to tremble even in the lamplight. Then she picked up her knitting, her needles clicking gently in rhythm with her thoughts. Tomorrow, she decided, she would speak with Annie. Not as the police would, but as one woman to another. For if the truth was to surface, it would come not from accusation, but from kindness. The following morning, the rain had lifted, leaving the village washed and glistening in the pale light. Miss Marple took the narrow path that led to the Loder servants' cottages at the edge of the meadow. It was early, the kind of hour when birds were still deciding whether to sing. Smoke curled lazily from the chimneys, and the smell of damp soil clung to the air. She found Annie sitting on a small bench outside her door, her apron crumpled, eyes red and swollen from crying. "Good morning, my dear," Miss Marple said softly, approaching as one might approach a frightened bird. "You've been working too hard, I think. The eyes always tell." Annie tried to stand, then sat again, twisting her hands. "I didn't mean no harm, ma'am. I did what I was told, that's all." "I know," said Miss Marple, taking a seat beside her. "But sometimes people tell us to do things they shouldn't. And sometimes, when we obey, it's because we think we have no choice." Tears welled again. "Mrs. Finch said the mistress's tea was to be stronger that morning, and that I wasn't to mention the new bottle of milk. She said the mistress couldn't abide the taste of the old one. So I used the fresh. But when I came back for the tray, Mrs. Finch was white as chalk. She said I wasn't to breathe a word." Miss Marple nodded, her voice quiet. "And did she tell you where the new bottle came from?" Annie hesitated, eyes darting toward the lane. "No, ma'am, but I saw her talking to Mr. Loder in the garden before breakfast. They was whispering. He looked angry. Said something about money and being done with it all." The words hung in the still air. Miss Marple placed a hand lightly over the girl's trembling fingers. "You've done the right thing by telling me. Fear makes fools of good people, but the truth makes them free again." When she left the cottage, the sun was climbing through the mist, pale but persistent. The manor stood ahead, tall and cold against the brightening sky. Miss Marple paused at the gate. Mr. Loder had been away on business the previous week, returning only the night before the death. A convenient absence, one might say. He was known to be respectable, distant, and more devoted to his accounts than to his wife. Yet there was something too still about his grief, the sort of quiet that hides calculation. By midday, she was seated once more in the vicarage drawing-room. Griselda poured tea, while the vicar looked troubled behind his spectacles. "You're not suggesting," he began hesitantly, "that Mr. Loder had a hand in his wife's death?" Miss Marple stirred her tea with delicate precision. "Suggesting? No. Observing, yes. He stands to inherit everything, of course, and if Mrs. Loder suspected anything improper, financial or otherwise, she might have intended to act. One must remember that murder, dear Leonard, often begins not with hatred, but with fear of being found out." Griselda frowned. "Then what of Mrs. Finch?" "Oh, she was merely the instrument," Miss Marple replied. "An obedient hand attached to someone else's will, but now that Annie has spoken, the cord between them is fraying. It's only a matter of time before someone tugs too hard." Outside, a horse cart rattled by, carrying crates from the dairy. The sound seemed to echo her words. Steady, rhythmic, inevitable. Miss Marple's eyes followed it through the window, her thoughts moving as quietly as the wheels turning down the lane. She had no proof yet, no confession, only the faint alignment of truths too precise to be coincidence. But she had learned long ago that guilt, like cream, always rises to the surface, if one waits long enough for the milk to settle. That evening, the lamps in St. Mary Mead flickered one by one to life, casting long, wavering shadows across the hedgerows. Miss Marple sat by her window as she often did at dusk, her knitting resting untouched in her lap. Across the lane she could see the faint glow from the manor, one light burning in the study, where Mr. Loder was said to have locked himself away since the funeral arrangements began. She thought of Annie's trembling voice, of Mrs. Finch's nervous deflections, and of a marriage that had looked so respectable from the outside, like fine china concealing a hairline crack. When the clock struck 8, a knock came at her door. It was Inspector Crail, his hat damp from the mist and his manner tinged with impatience. "Evening, Miss Marple," he said, stepping inside at her invitation. "You've been asking a good many questions about this case. I thought you might as well know. The coroner's reports come through. Traces of chloral hydrate in the bloodstream, enough to stop the heart of a woman her age." Miss Marple poured him tea, her face mild. "How curious, and yet not unexpected." He blinked. "You mean you knew?" "I suspected," she corrected gently. "It's a woman's sort of poison. Easy to conceal, difficult to detect unless one is looking. I dare say Mrs. Loder trusted whoever handed her that cup implicitly." The inspector sighed, running a hand over his brow. "The maid's frightened out of her wits. Says she didn't know what she was doing, and the cook's refusing to speak without a solicitor." "I imagine she's afraid of her employer," Miss Marple said, adding a drop of milk to her cup. "And fear, Inspector, is quite the efficient leash." Crail frowned. "You think the husband's behind this, then?" "I think," she said softly, "that Mr. Loder is a man accustomed to control. Men like that don't take kindly to interference. Mrs. Loder was sharp enough to notice things. Small withdrawals from the household accounts, perhaps. A letter, maybe, that wasn't meant for her eyes. A confrontation at breakfast could have been quite inconvenient." The inspector stared into his cup, saying nothing. Outside, the wind brushed the windows like a whisper. When he left, Miss Marple sat for a while in silence, her gaze resting on the cooling teapot. The next morning, she dressed with quiet purpose and made her way once more to the manor. This time, she asked for Mr. Loder directly. The butler hesitated, but finally showed her into the study. The room smelled of tobacco and stale air. Mr. Loder sat behind a wide oak desk, a man of rigid composure, his grief arranged as neatly as the papers before him. "Miss Marple," he said, forcing a smile. "You've come, I suppose, with condolences." "In a manner of speaking," she replied, "though condolences are rather wasted where suspicion already sits." His smile froze. "I beg your pardon." She stepped closer, her tone as calm as ever. "Your cook was persuaded to add something to your wife's tea. You likely assured her it was harmless." A sleeping draught for nerves, perhaps, but you misjudged the dose. You meant to frighten her, not kill her. Unfortunately, such plans rarely stop where one intends them to. For a moment, his mask held. Then his fingers tightened around his pen until it snapped cleanly in two. He said nothing, only stared at her with eyes that had turned to glass. Miss Marple sighed, almost sadly. You see, Mr. Loder, the truth always seeps through, like spilled milk on a polished table. One can wipe the surface, but the stain remains beneath. When she left, she found Inspector Crale waiting at the gate. He looked at her questioningly, and she gave the smallest nod. You might send for him now, she said softly. He's not dangerous. Just a man who's been trying far too long to appear blameless. The inspector tipped his hat, and Miss Marple walked home through the quiet lanes, her steps unhurried. The mist had begun to lift again, revealing the faint glimmer of morning light over the fields. Behind her, the village bell tolled once, slow and solemn, as if to mark not tragedy, but inevitability. The following day dawned with a clarity rare for October. Crisp air, long shadows, and the faint scent of wood smoke drifting from cottage chimneys. The village, still humming with gossip, had already decided Mr. Loder's guilt long before the law confirmed it. At the grocer's, they spoke of forged wills, at the post office, of secret affairs, and at the vicarage, of justice, divine or otherwise. Yet Miss Marple, walking her usual path past the churchyard, was not entirely satisfied. There was a piece missing, a small sharp edge that didn't quite fit the picture everyone was so eager to frame. That afternoon she called upon Inspector Crale once more. He greeted her at the station, weary but triumphant. It's done, he said. He broke this morning, admitted to slipping the chloral hydrate into her cup. Said it was only meant to quiet her down. They'd quarreled over money, apparently. Claimed he panicked when she collapsed. Miss Marple nodded slowly. And Mrs. Finch? Still denying everything, the inspector said with a shrug. Says she thought it was just a sleeping mixture. The Crown will likely let her off with leniency. Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the window. Outside, a pair of children ran past, their laughter thin in the cool air. Tell me, Inspector, she said after a moment, was it Mr. Loder who ordered the special delivery of milk that morning? Crale blinked. I expect so. Why? Because, she said softly, Mr. Loder never took milk in his tea. His wife did, precisely 1 spoon of sugar and just enough milk to cloud it. And if one were planning such a thing, one would hardly risk tampering with the very bottle the maid carried in broad daylight. No. The poisoner would have prepared it earlier, when the house was quiet and the servants still asleep. The inspector frowned. But he confessed. Yes, Miss Marple replied, because guilt and confusion often travel together. He may have believed himself responsible. Indeed, he may even have wished it were so, but I think Mr. Loder was not the only hand in this. She rose from her chair, her tone still mild, but edged with quiet conviction. I should like a word with Mrs. Finch. There are certain things I must ask her. Small things, really, but small things are what build a murder. By evening, she was once more in the manor kitchen. Mrs. Finch sat at the wooden table, hands clasped tightly, her face pale beneath the lamplight. Miss Marple spoke gently, her words almost kind. I believe you thought it would help him, my dear. That if Mrs. Loder were frightened or ill for a few days, he might come back to you. You were fond of him once, weren't you? The woman's breath hitched, and for a long moment the only sound was the ticking of the wall clock. Then she whispered, He said she was cruel, that she'd ruined him. I only meant to make her sleep a while, give him peace. Her voice broke. When she didn't wake, he looked at me as if I'd killed them both. Miss Marple sighed, and there was no triumph in it, only quiet weariness. Love, Mrs. Finch, is the most dangerous motive of all. It convinces the guilty they are merciful, and the innocent they are powerless. Later, as she walked home through the deepening dusk, the lamps of St. Mary Mead glowed like patient eyes. The case would end, as such cases always did. The law satisfied, the village whispering, and 2 lives forever broken. Miss Marple paused at her gate, looking toward the faint silhouette of the church tower. It was, she thought, the oldest story in the world, a cup of tea, a touch of poison, and a heart foolish enough to believe that love could ever remain untarnished. She went inside, lit her fire, and sat down by the window, listening to the soft wind against the panes. The village once more at peace, though never quite innocent again. For several days, life in St. Mary Mead returned to its ordinary rhythm, or what passed for ordinary, in a village where everyone still spoke in lowered voices at the mention of the loaders. The milkman resumed his rounds. The vicar preached forgiveness, and Mrs. Bantry had already begun planning her next tea-gathering, though she could not resist remarking that one never quite trusted milk the same way after such an affair. Miss Marple, for her part, went about her routines with her usual calm precision, though her thoughts were not yet settled. Something within her, quiet, persistent, like a clock ticking in another room, told her the story had not yet found its true ending. On a mild afternoon, she visited Dr. Haydock under the pretext of a headache. He was sorting through papers when she entered, and though he smiled, his expression carried the weight of lingering unease. "It's all rather dreadful," he said, handing her a chair. "The trial will be quick enough. Finch has confessed to her part, and the husband will hang. I don't suppose justice could be clearer." "Justice, perhaps," Miss Marple said softly. "But clarity, I'm not so certain." He looked up sharply. "You mean to say there's doubt?" "Only this," she replied. "If Mrs. Finch wished merely to make the poor woman sleep, why would she choose a dose sufficient to kill? She was an experienced cook. She'd know how much was too much. And as for Mr. Loder, his temper was that of a man who strikes words, not women. I can imagine him cruel, even desperate, but not calculated." The doctor frowned. "Then what do you think happened?" "I think," she said slowly, "that Mrs. Loder was not as helpless as everyone believed." Later that evening, Miss Marple sat by her fire, the glow soft on her face. She had been reading through the coroner's notes, copies given to her by the kindly inspector, who, in his way, had come to trust her instincts. There it was in black and white, the fatal amount of chloral hydrate, mixed not evenly but clumped, inconsistent, almost hurried. The poison had been stirred into a cup, yes, but not well. The milk had masked the bitterness only partly. And yet Mrs. Loder had drunk it all. A woman as meticulous as Mrs. Loder, cautious, particular about her health, and known for her dislike of strong-tasting medicines, would surely have noticed. Unless, of course, she had known exactly what she was drinking. The next morning, Miss Marple walked to the churchyard where the grave was still fresh. A black ribbon fluttered on the wreaths, its edge frayed by wind. As she stood there, she remembered a conversation from years past. Mrs. Loder at a charity luncheon, speaking of her husband with a tight smile, saying how some men never notice poison until it's in their own cup. It had been a figure of speech then, a clever remark to a table of women who laughed politely. But now, standing before the gravestone, Miss Marple could almost hear the echo of that tone, poised, deliberate, and faintly cruel. She understood at last. Mrs. Loder, proud and unforgiving, had seen her husband's deception, the cook's sympathy, and the gossip that followed her every move. She had orchestrated her own death to ruin them both, leaving a trail so neat it could only end in tragedy. She had taken the dose herself, too much, deliberately, knowing the suspicion would fall where it would hurt most. Miss Marple turned away from the grave, her heart heavy yet calm. There would be no undoing it now. To reveal such a truth would only deepen the ruin already done. Some stories, she thought, were best left to rest with the dead. As she walked home through the fading afternoon, she could hear the distant toll of the church bell, slow, measured, and solemn, as if the village itself were breathing out its last sigh of rumor. The case of Mrs. Loder would pass into quiet legend, another tale whispered over garden fences and teacups. But Miss Marple, alone in her cottage, knew the truth that others never would. Sometimes justice comes dressed in innocence, and guilt, like milk, can be stirred so smoothly into the cup that no one tastes its bitterness until the very end. The days that followed were curiously still. Autumn settled deeper into St. Mary Mead, the air carrying that faint, smoky sweetness that comes before winter. Leaves rustled in the hedges, children laughed again on the green, and slowly the shadow of the Loder affair began to thin. But Miss Marple, sitting at her window one late afternoon, found she could not quite let the matter rest. Not because she doubted her conclusion. She rarely did once her mind had settled. But because she could not ignore the smallest ripple left behind. The maid Annie, who had vanished quietly 2 mornings after the funeral. She had told no one where she was going. Mrs. Bantry said she'd gone to stay with her aunt in Reading, but the postmistress swore no such relative existed. It was, Miss Marple thought, unlike Annie to disappear without a word of thanks or farewell. Fear could make a person run, yes, but Annie's fear had been of the living, not the dead. That evening, Miss Marple walked to the manor once more. The house was half-shuttered now, the staff dismissed, its garden growing unkempt beneath the pale light. She found Mrs. Finch there, packing the last of her things into a trunk. The woman's face had aged in a fortnight. Her hands moved with the dullness of someone who no longer knew where to go. "She left, did she not?" Miss Marple asked quietly. "Annie." Mrs. Finch hesitated. "Aye. Said she couldn't sleep. Said she kept seeing the mistress's face. I told her she'd best go for both our sakes. And she took something with her." The cook blinked. "Only her wages." Miss Marple nodded. "And a letter, perhaps. One she found among the mistress's things. Folded, sealed, but not addressed." Mrs. Finch's lips parted, then closed again. "You knew?" "I suspected," Miss Marple replied. "Mrs. Loder was clever, too clever to leave her revenge to chance. That letter, I imagine, explained everything in her own words. Annie must have read it. Poor child, she would have felt the weight of it like a stone." Mrs. Finch sank into a chair. "Then it's true. The mistress meant to die." "She meant," said Miss Marple softly, "for her death to speak louder than her life. Some people, Mrs. Finch, cannot bear humiliation. They prefer to write the final chapter themselves." The room fell silent except for the faint ticking of a clock somewhere deep in the hall. Outside, the wind had risen, scattering leaves across the gravel path. Miss Marple looked toward the window, her reflection blurred in the glass. "If Annie did take that letter," she added gently, "we must hope she burns it. Truth is a fine thing, but it can be cruel in the wrong hands." When she stepped out into the cold evening, the sky was streaked with violet and ash. She walked home slowly, her breath visible in the cooling air. Behind her, the manor loomed dark and hollow, a monument to pride, love, and the quiet poisons people brew within their hearts. Later, by the fire, she closed her eyes and listened to the village settling into night. Somewhere, far off, a dog barked once, then fell silent. Miss Marple drew her shawl around her shoulders, murmuring half to herself, half to the darkness beyond the window pane. That human nature, even in its gentlest forms, never ceased to surprise her. And though St. Mary Mead would wake tomorrow to gossip about rationing or rose shows or the latest sermon, she knew that in its quiet corners the echoes of milk, sugar, and murder would linger, like the faint aftertaste of something once sweet, now gone cold. The first frost came a week later. It silvered the fields at dawn and left the windows of St. Mary Mead painted with delicate feathers of ice. The village had nearly settled back into its rhythm when a letter arrived at Miss Marple's door. It was unsigned, written in a hurried scrawl on cheap paper, the ink smudged in places as though by trembling fingers. "I did what you said. I burned the letter. But there was another. Someone else has it now. Please don't let them find me. No name, no address. Only the faintest scent of smoke on the page." Miss Marple read it twice, then folded it carefully and set it beside the teapot. Her eyes lingered on the handwriting, smaller this time, more deliberate. Annie's fear had grown sharper, not softer. That meant she was still close. She spent the afternoon walking through the village under the guise of errands. The grocer said he'd seen a young woman matching Annie's description near the railway 2 nights ago. The postmistress added that a telegram had been sent from Much Benham that morning, addressed to someone in London, signed only IF. Miss Marple thanked them both and returned home, her mind quietly connecting threads others would never see. That evening, she went to the vicarage, where Leonard and Griselda were finishing supper. "I wonder," she said mildly, "if either of you recall whether Mrs. Loder received any post in her last week. Anything from London, perhaps?" Griselda frowned. "I do remember the postman mentioning a letter from a solicitor. Something about a trust. Why?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Because it seems Mrs. Loder had a habit of preparing for endings. She may have written more than one letter that morning. One to condemn, another to absolve." Dr. Haydock, who had dropped in for tea, looked puzzled. "You think she meant for both to be found?" "Oh, no," Miss Marple said softly. "Only one. But she knew people. She knew that once you scatter secrets in a household full of fear, they rarely stay buried where you left them." That night she sat long by the fire, reading Annie's note again. If there was another letter, someone in the village had it, and whoever held it would hold the final truth of Mrs. Loder's design. Not content with revenge alone, the dead woman had left one last snare, a secret waiting to be found by the wrong hands. When dawn broke, Miss Marple rose with a sense of quiet inevitability. She wrapped her shawl, stepped out into the cold morning, and turned toward the old lane that led to the manor. The house stood dark and empty now, but the letter would not have gone far. Secrets in St. Mary Mead had a way of circling home again. As she reached the gate, she noticed a figure waiting there, Mrs. Price Ridley, clutching her handbag with unusual tension. "You're up early," Miss Marple said pleasantly. The woman gave a tight smile. "Just walking, clearing my head." Miss Marple's gaze dropped to the edge of the handbag, where a torn scrap of paper protruded, thick, cream-colored, the kind used for personal stationery. Her voice, when she spoke, was soft but steady. "I don't suppose you'd mind if I saw what you've found, Mrs. Price Ridley. It's quite important, you know." For a moment, neither moved. Then the older woman's hand trembled, and the letter fell to the ground. The wind caught it, opening it just enough for a single line to show before it skittered across the frost. "He will not suffer alone." Miss Marple bent slowly, her arm fingers closing over the page before the wind could take it farther. Her eyes, calm and unreadable, met Mrs. Price Ridley's. "Ah," she said quietly. "So it was never quite finished after all." And as the church bell tolled in the distance, she turned back toward the lane, the letter folded neatly in her gloved hand. Proof not of guilt or innocence, but of how even death, when guided by pride, could find one last way to whisper. Miss Marple stood in the lane for a long moment, the cold air brushing against her face as the church bell faded into silence. The folded letter felt strangely warm in her gloved hand, as though carrying the last trace of a living heartbeat. Mrs. Price Ridley, flustered and pale, muttered something about finding it near the hedge and hurried off without looking back. But Miss Marple knew that nothing ever simply turned up in St. Mary Mead. Things were found because they were meant to be. She returned home slowly, her steps careful, her thoughts weaving themselves into quiet order. The letter, its single visible line, "He will not suffer alone," was both a confession and a curse. Mrs. Loder's vengeance had reached further than anyone suspected, even from the grave. It had drawn in not just her husband and the cook, but the village itself, the whisperers, the watchers, the ones who fed on scandal like sugar in tea. By the time she reached her cottage, the frost had begun to lift. She lit her fire, placed the kettle on, and carefully unfolded the letter on her writing desk. The rest of the message was brief, written in Mrs. Loder's precise, looping hand. "If he believes himself innocent, let him live long enough to see how easily the world turns on those who seem guilty. I trust my little dramas to the honesty of others." It was signed simply, M.L. Miss Marple sat very still. She understood now that the letter had been left deliberately unfinished, an open snare for conscience and curiosity alike. The phrase, "the honesty of others," struck her most, because in St. Mary Mead, honesty was rarely pure and never simple. Someone had found this letter after the death, someone who had chosen to keep it hidden until it became useful. A knock interrupted her thoughts. When she opened the door, Inspector Crale stood there, hat in hand, looking far more tired than his usual bluster allowed. "I came to tell you," he said. "They've suspended Mr. Loder's sentence. New evidence. A letter's turned up." Miss Marple looked at him quietly. "Ah, Mrs. Price Ridley wasted no time, I see." He frowned. "You mean she found it, yes," Miss Marple said softly, "though I dare say it was slipped into her path rather conveniently. Mrs. Loder's work still reaching from beyond." Crale rubbed his temple. "The court will have to review everything again. The Crown may withdraw the charge altogether. The poison, the confession, it's all in question now." "And Mrs. Finch?" "Released. She's gone to stay with a sister near Bath. Says she won't come back." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "It's just as well. Too much truth is a heavy thing for most people to carry." After he left, she watched from her window as the fog thickened across the fields, soft and colorless. Somewhere beyond it, the village would already be alive with the news. The miraculous letter, the reprieve, the latest twist in a tale they'd half forgotten to feel guilty about. Yet she knew how it would end. A slow return to chatter, to gardens and knitting circles, to the same quiet cruelties dressed in good manners. She folded the letter once more and placed it in the fire. The paper curled, blackened, and was gone. The flame flared briefly, then dimmed to embers. "Rest now," she murmured, as if speaking to Mrs. Loder herself. "You've had your curtain call." Outside, a bird began to sing, hesitant, uncertain, as though testing whether the air was safe again. Miss Marple poured her tea, the milk swirling gently into the cup. Life, as always, went on, but somewhere in the back of her mind, she wondered how many other stories in St. Mary Mead were still being written quietly, waiting for their moment to rise from the depths of ordinary life and reveal what lay beneath the surface of civility. The following morning dawned with an unsettling quiet. Even the birds seemed hesitant to sing, as though the air itself were holding its breath. Miss Marple awoke early, not because she intended to, but because something within her refused to let her sleep. The night's embers still faintly glowed in the grate, where the letter had burned down to fine grey ash. Yet the unease that lingered felt as though something had remained unconsumed. A thought, a trace, a whisper that refused to fade. By mid-morning, the post arrived, and with it came a small envelope addressed to her in an unfamiliar hand. The ink was faded, the script neat and deliberate. Inside was a single sheet of paper bearing just 4 words. "You burned the wrong one." Miss Marple read it twice, her expression scarcely changing. Only the slightest tightening around her eyes betrayed the quiet shock that pulsed beneath her calm. She placed the letter on the table, poured herself a cup of tea, and sat down to think. It could be mischief. The village had no shortage of it. Yet something in the phrasing struck her as precise, purposeful. Whoever had sent it knew exactly what she had done the night before, and that meant they had been close. Close enough to see the smoke, perhaps, or close enough to know what had burned. After breakfast, she stepped out into the pale sun and walked to the post office. Miss Hartnell, behind the counter, looked up eagerly. "Morning, Miss Marple. You'll have heard, no doubt, about the second letter?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Another letter?" "Oh, yes. Turned up in Much Benham, so they say. The constable there sent word to Inspector Crale. Supposed to be from Mrs. Loder herself, written the day before she died." Miss Marple's hands rested lightly on her handbag. "How fortunate," she murmured, "that the dead find such persistence in communication." That afternoon, she met Crale outside the station. He looked unsettled, his usual gruff certainty blunted. "We've had another of her letters delivered," he said without preamble. "Posted in London 2 days before the murder. Same handwriting. It says she feared for her life, that her husband had been planning something. That's why the judge has dropped the case altogether. Loder's been released." "Released?" Miss Marple's voice was calm, but the smallest flicker passed through her eyes. "And where is he now?" "Gone to the coast, they think, but between you and me, he'll never come back here. The whole business has ruined him." Miss Marple nodded absently, though her mind was far elsewhere. A letter posted in London. Mrs. Loder had not been in London for weeks before her death. Nor had she written to anyone there, according to the post records. Someone was still playing her game and playing it well. That evening, she returned home as the last light faded from the village. Her garden glistened faintly with dew, and the air smelled of turned earth. She stood by the gate for a long while, gazing at the lane that curved out of sight toward the manor. In that quiet, she could almost hear Mrs. Loder's voice, cultured, sharp, amused, whispering from some cold corner of eternity, "I trust my little dramas to the honesty of others." Miss Marple sighed softly, a sound half of sorrow, half of understanding. It seemed Mrs. Loder's final performance had not yet ended, and someone, perhaps someone very much alive, was still taking their cues from her script. She locked her door, drew her curtains, and settled by the fire once more, her knitting resting untouched in her lap. The village outside slept, innocent as it wished to appear. But Miss Marple knew better. St. Mary Mead never truly slept. It only paused between secrets. The end.